Okay, we are live. Another Talk the Tings, Navigating Grief. And we are on episode 2. And today's episode, we're talking about living with grief. Really, we're going to be looking at daily life, the triggers that come, and how this impacts our relationships. But before we go into that, you just met us on this topic last week. So we wanted to do a little bit of a recap about episode 1, which is live on YouTube. You can watch it on my channel at MediaBizTO. And it will be the one before this one. So you can watch it there. And be free to comment and so on. We have a tool in the caption as well for you to reflect on each episode. I will put the tool in this episode as well. So Greg and Leslie, our psychotherapist, is here, and he will tell us a little bit about what they missed in the last episode, because we kind of were doing broad strokes. We were doing defining, understanding grief before we got into the deep stuff.
True. So good afternoon. Thank you for welcoming me again to this platform. So just recapping. So in our first episode, we talked about what is grief. So just looking at the signs, the symptoms, and the impact. And I think we were using the word grief and mourning interchangeably, but just want to be clear that grief is just an embodiment of the different symptoms that you'll feel. And then the mourning are the rituals, the things you do, the customs, the things that you do, the process you take on to feel better, the funerals, the memorials, the personal rituals. You may create a memory book or write a letter to yourself just based on reflecting on the experience. We also talked about trauma and its impacts as it relates to grief and trauma as well. Those things are based on a clear definition. Just want to be clear. Trauma is the immediate or impending danger that one may feel that might be psychological, physical, or a combination of both. And a lot of people deal with that, whether it be directly or vicariously. So just want to be clear around those themes so that we are helping the audience to navigate themselves through this topic while being able to, learn some new things. We also talked about the stages of grief, the denial, the disbelief, the bargaining, and the acceptance, and for some anger, and the stages that one may go through. They're not linear. You may go from one and ebb and flow through them all, depending on where you are as you deal with your grief. We're also clear in mentioning that grief is not only losing physically someone through death, but it could also be losing property or things or relationships that we lose as a result of some of the things, losses that we encounter in life. One that came up for me, just based on individuals that watched the episode, was grieving losses through immigration. A lot of individuals right now, the person that I was talking to, they are dealing with impacts of the Iranian war and the losses that impact their family, and then others through the Middle East crisis and so on. So just, I think the topic allowed people to expand your reach based on the people that I interacted with. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion, but just wanted to provide a highlight of what we talked about to give the audience a refresher.
Yes, and it's good to highlight because we're going to go a little bit deeper today. We're going to not just stay on the surface. We're going to hopefully impart more knowledge. I'm, when I was getting ready for this, Greg, I was like, we're going into the grief classroom. Uh, you know, so we're going into the grief classroom. We're going to get some tools. We're going to call a thing a thing. We're going to
Mhm,
name things, but we're also going to go a little bit below the surface. So,
mhm.
and that's why you'll see the ticker come up every now and again throughout the show. It's a content warning. This episode discusses death, loss, and trauma. I want to remind you that you can step away and come back to it because it will live on YouTube. So you can always come
Mhm.
back to it. But if it is, if it's too much at the time that you're watching at the segment that we're on, feel free to walk away and take care of yourself. We're trying to do this in love, and holding you in the best possible way. One of the things that you will see us do, we will implicate each other, will implicate ourselves in storytelling, because both of us have also experienced loss and grief, and so you will get some of those exemplars, and then we'll also have outside of us exemplars, and just to allow for a multi-layered media approach to this topic, which I think is it can be really heavy. So I don't want us to miss that, and so we're gonna handle it with care as best as possible. So remember that, keep that in mind as we go through today. um, Greg, as we start off today talking about living with grief, and I'm going to play a clip that I want you to pay attention to, because I feel like something was said at the end of this clip that we might want to correct, or not necessarily correct, but
Unpack.
give a different take on.
Perspective. Okay.
Yeah, so this is Billy Bob Thornton. He was interviewed some time back, and he was talking about how he feels about losing his brother. So that's where we're gonna get going, guys. We're gonna get right into it. So this is our starter clip.
Yeah, I've never been the same since my brother died. There's a melancholy in me that never goes away. I'm 50% happy and 50% sad at any given moment. And the only advice I can give people for when you lose someone like that is you won't ever get over it. And the more you know that and embrace it, the better off you are. I don't want to forget my brother, and I don't want to forget what it felt like when he died, because he deserves it. That's how important he was to me. So if I have to suffer, and if I have to be sad for the rest of my life, and if I have to be lonely without him, without his particular thing, his sense of humor and what he brought to life, then that's the way I honor him.
So you can imagine why I want you to.
There's so much I want to almost pinch myself for not kind of taking some notes, because it was such a loaded clip. A lot stood out. The one I'll probably start by saying we all grieve our losses differently, and I think that's important. So I would say, like, that's it, there's no blueprint. It's not universal. And I would also say the weight that we put into our grief is based on our personal connection and relationship, as he described the relationship that he had with his brother. It seems to me that they were inseparable. And for him, one of the key things, of the many things that he talked about, is how he's going to memorialize his brother, and that's the mourning. So he, for his lifetime, he's going to mourn his brother by carrying him in the way of recognizing how much different losses he has as a result of losing his brother. His sense of humor he talked about, right? So I think those are the personal connections and the nuances and the way we weave ourselves into something, right?
Yeah.
So it's the more, I would say, interconnection and tied we are to something, if we're looking at it as a metaphor, the harder it might be to unwind, right? So if it's like a ball of thread and you kind of throw it, it's untangled, you're going to just imagine that that's going to be hard to correct again.
Yeah.
Right. So go ahead.
So one of the things I was concerned about him saying was, if I have to suffer for the rest of my life, then so be it. You can speak to this from a therapeutic lens. We don't want people to suffer forever in grief.
True.
And so I'm assuming when the clip was done, it was maybe new grief or raw grief for him, or complex grief for him. So I just want to, even from the onset, just let's interrupt the suffering piece, if you can.
So again, I'm going to reflect back on what he said, and that's what I would challenge. So he sounds to me like he's making a defined choice to continue to suffer based on his loss, right? So I would then talk to him about making this choice, and what is this idea of suffering that he's going to be going through. Because he
Mhm.
said he's 50% happy and 50% sad. So
Mhm.
I would speak more about his sadness and look at the varied emotions that he has, the sorrow, the despair, probably the denial, the disbelief,
Mhm.
and really try to take him through those emotions. But it
Mhm.
also sounds like he wants to hold on to pain.
Yeah.
So, right, just helping him understand, making a correlation between the pain and stress,
Mhm.
and looking at some of the physical impact stress can have.
Mhm.
And I would say the stress that he's putting himself through is probably going to change himself physically, depending on the behaviors that he's taking on. For example, if those behaviors are negative, if
Mhm.
he's drinking, smoking, or just doing, risky things, that
Mhm.
might make it challenging.
Mhm.
But if he's doing engaging in positive coping things, like perhaps seeing a therapist, talking about it,
Mhm.
that sorrow that he speaks of, I wouldn't. I think it would change over time. I think some of the
Right.
things that you talked about is what we identified last week, where individuals, we look at it through a continuum.
Yeah.
So I would say he's at the stage where he's pre-contemplating, where he's deciding to stay in this despair.
Mhm.
I would talk to him about the impact the stress is going to have on him, the despair is going to have on him. If
Mhm.
it's also changed, for example, is he continuing to be an actor? Is he continuing to take roles? Is he just like how much of his life has changed? Is he continuing to engage in the thing that he once used to? So just
Mhm.
looking at some of those baseline things in his life to
Mhm.
see how much of this idea of the suffering is he really going through.
Mhm.
Not to challenge around um, his affluence and how realistic is he suffering, but just see how the impact the suffering is having on him. So we're
Yeah.
really focusing on his wellness and this idea of suffering, right? And
Yeah.
challenging the 50% on either side.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking about that suffering or that long lasting, why does grief sometimes feel harder months later or even years later than it does at the beginning? And I can give an example here. So
Mhm.
I experienced the loss of my mom when I was about to be 6 years old. And I know people look at me crazy when I say I still feel that loss. And there are times when I feel it even more than I would have when I was 6. And similarly, like we're going into year 3 of the loss of my dad. And some days it feels like it was yesterday. What is
Mhm.
that? Why does grief feel harder later?
Um, so I'm gonna give you unpack the both examples. So the one from your mom, you
Mm-hmm.
were very young,
Mm-hmm.
um, in adolescence. So as you get older, you cognitively get smarter, you realize more, you learn more, you have a great understanding how to navigate the world, you have views around death and loss, and you probably understand what it is more. So I would say, as it relates to your mom, um, while it did impact you initially, it impacted you more, in my opinion, later, just based on life and understanding the loss and the magnitude of the person that you
Mm-hmm.
lost, right? And
Mm-hmm.
just making the different connections around the different milestones and the thing that you probably miss as it relates to your mom, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, those are reasons that it would probably hit harder.
Mm-hmm.
As it relates to your dad, again, the connection, the relationship, and still, depending on how you look at time, 3 years is still very fresh,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and again, we're having conversations like this where I would say you have a profound knowledge about grief,
Mm-hmm.
where you could unpack it academically. Your intelligence helps you to understand it more. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we take ourselves down the rabbit hole just based on our understanding around things. And sometimes we make it harder in our mind, and we also feed some of those intrusive thoughts that lead us to continue to go down a rabbit hole. And then at times, depending on what's happened in life, which doesn't stop happening, situations happen, and that may just make it amount to more, where it just seems overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
So at times it hit hard. It's just just recognizing and the loss, the magnitude of the loss, the level of relationships. And as he said, I want to be clear. So I would ask you, when you say you're grieving your loss, what are the things that you miss most about your dad that, brings back his memory and make it so vivid for you?
Hmm. I mean, it flows into our next segment on triggers, but
Mm-hmm.
there are conversations, and I think similarly for my mom,
Mm-hmm.
there are things, as you said, life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm older and have experienced some things, and I would love to share those things,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not around to share those things.
Mm-hmm.
So me and my dad had a complex relationship, but especially towards the end of the last 7 years of his life, we had a very good relationship. And he was he was showing me all the things that I had looked for before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So nobody was prouder than me, honey. Like
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm. Of
he was he
course.
was nobody was prouder. He was if I sent him a clip of something I did, apparently he was sharing it with all my his family members.
Mm-hmm.
He would send me, when he started getting to texting more, he would text, we had a long email thread, like all of those things now. When something significant happens,
Mm-hmm.
my immediate response is, I can't tell him. He's not physically
Mm-hmm.
present to
Mm-hmm.
do all the
Mm-hmm.
excitement around that.
Right.
So I think that's important. And I think similarly from my mom, like she never got to see me graduate anything. You know what I mean? She
Mm-hmm.
missed
Mm-hmm.
out on life. She missed out
Mm-hmm.
on all my life.
Right.
And those things kind of irk me a little bit. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
would my life have been different? What were the experiences that I would have? And each time these things come up,
Mm-hmm.
I go through that where I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
wonder what she would think, wonder what she would have done, wonder
Mm-hmm.
how this would have played out. So
Mm-hmm.
I think they're similar but different.
Agreed, agreed. And some of what makes grief hard is the ambivalence, that
Mhm,
unknown, right?
mhm, mhm,
That we cycle on our own and try to make sense of. And oftentimes that, is the breaking point and the driving point for a lot of people because we're cycling those things,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And I think the key thing that you identified is the relationships and all of those nuances within relationship that we may not necessarily define, but
mhm,
those are all the things that we miss in those people, right?
mhm, mhm,
Especially based on the connection. So that's what we're talking about, like you not being able to share those things with your person
mhm,
and how that relationship ignited so many different parts of your life as it relates to joy and love and togetherness and
mhm,
fellowship. So
mhm,
those are all losses, right?
mhm,
But we
mhm,
don't necessarily talk about or identify them like that. But those are the things that we miss most about those people that we have connections to when those losses are cut off.
yes. Yes. And as we talk about that, we're going to transition into triggers
Mm-hmm.
and emotional surges. Some people call it waves. Some people call it grief hijack.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll use the word triggers, right?
Okay. Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. So we'll use the word triggers, and I'm going to play somebody who's well known in terms of grief and depression,
Mm-hmm.
David Kessler. Let's hear his take on these triggers.
One of the things, David, that really catches people off guard is how you can think that you're through it, but then all of a sudden grief comes out of nowhere. You know what I mean? Like suddenly you're crying in the grocery store, or it's a random Tuesday and it's been years and you're just flooded with sadness. Why does grief ambush you like that?
Let's talk about that. The thing is, I call those grief bursts.
Grief bursts?
Grief bursts. You're at work, things are fine, something happens, you go there, it comes up, it overwhelms you. It's a grief burst. So I want to normalize that.
Okay.
Now, not only is there a grief burst, I want you to think about this. With anyone in my life, my son, I didn't just love my son like, I love him. Oh my gosh, like anyone in our life. Some days we're pissed at them. Some days we really love them. Some days they touch our heart. Other days, not so much. Not only do we have grief bursts after someone dies, we have love bursts.
Hmm.
We just get filled with love. And both of those things are normal. But I also want you to know the second time people show up for support is after the 1 year mark, thinking, I thought this was going to go away at a year. Isn't that what's supposed to happen? Not true. I often think of early grief, and this is what people need to know, especially if you've got a friend out there and you're wondering when they're going to get over this. I think of early grief as the first 2 years. Early grief is the first 2 years. Your friend that's taking too long is still in early grief.
So that was compliments of Mel Robbins' podcast. Why can a smell, a song, a date suddenly bring back everything, Greg?
Your senses, those are like sensory stuff. Things you see, things you smell, things you touch often stay with you. So these sensory emotions, sometimes they just come out of the whim based on the environment that we're in that stimulates it. It might be a good example would be you. Oftentimes people remember the cologne that person wears. They can remember the sound of their voice. So those integral things often remind individuals of the person, and those things could just happen out of the whim. You could be walking to his point, just in a mall at school, and you smell or hear something, or you hear a song played, and then it just reminds you, and then the floodgate open where he talked about this burst, and this burst also brings about an onslaught of emotion based on what you're going through. So it could be the crying, the sorrow, the despair, the depression, depending on what you're going through. I liked how he put a spin on it, because those triggers can also bring back beautiful memories, right? I think oftentimes we dwell on the negative side of like the loss, because it's so intense, and the emotions, like they come, like they're involuntary, like they just come out of nowhere, right? So these sensory reminders, again, we can't do nothing about smelling. We can't do nothing about the things that we hear, because sometimes those things are random, and some environments are unpredictable. And one of the things that I want to make clear is that we talked about last week. The reason that the triggers are so intense is because it brings us back to that moment where we have the timestamp and everything is coming back. Last week we played 2 clips where natural disasters are things that people remember commonly, right? So similarly, your grief, trauma, memory is like that. You're just going to remember everything, and it's just so vivid. Right? Especially if you have a sensory overload. For some people, depending on if it was a food that person likes, the smelling the food is too much. So for a lot of times, a lot of people will have change in behavior. They stop eating particular foods. For a lot of people that I see in my work, they're not able to deal or be around the sight of blood, depending if they're impacted, depending on the time of their trauma, right? So some of these things just leave vivid memories where your trauma or memory response, that's what leads to the post-traumatic stress, because you just can't get over the situation, and it just becomes a constant reminder where you're dealing with repeated or more events that just keep you in that space. One of the things that he talked about that I really like, it's what we talked about last week. Your grief that you go through is a journey, and the first 2 years might just be you missing the person, where you're dealing with the anxiety, the fear, the panic attacks, the crying, the disbelief, probably a bit more shrewd, probably a bit more cynical, probably a bit more withdrawn, not doing things that you used to do, probably a bit more reserved. All of that is happening, and that's where the change in you is coming, right? So the triggers are very important, because they provoke so much, and they could be intense depending on how well you've managed some of those physical emotional symptoms as it relates to grief.
Yeah. So for me, like, I like knowing things, right? So
Mhm.
is there something happening in the brain that the memory latches on? Are we doing this as humans? Do we lock, kind of lock in a scent to a person? We lock in, like, what is the brain doing here?
So we have, as you know, long-term and short-term memory, and
Hmm.
we have different parts of the brain. This is where the psychology and social work comes through now. The
Yes.
hippocampus, the reptilian brain, the mammal brain, and so on. So there are parts of our brain. I
Yeah.
don't want to say the wrong thing, so I would say look this up. But there's definitely, you can fact check this. There's just parts of the brain, to your question, that holds on to things.
Hmm.
And the thing that they're hold on to are triggered by various memories. And we talked about the memories being triggers, but these memories can also be dreams. These memories can also be flashbacks. These
Hmm.
memories can also be similar experience where you feel like you're having a deja vu, right? So they don't just happen in the way of triggers, but then they happen also in these other ways, right? And to your point, um, your brain holds on to these things subconsciously and unconsciously, and
Hmm.
things happen that remind you of them and re-emerge them. And for a lot of people, where their grief is intense and complex, they're bombarded by these things a bit more often than someone that is not engaged or impacted by the grief as much as others would be, because
Yeah.
there's some that we get over. Not generalizing that people don't know that love their coworkers, but you may have not spent a long time with a person, but you may have attended the funeral, and
Right.
but to kind of go back to work normally. But if you had worked with that person over years and developed a relationship, whether even be professional, there might be a larger impact, right? So I think some of the things that you highlighted at the top, relationships have a lot to do with how much we carry um, our grief,
Hmm.
just based on the connections and the camaraderie, the engagement, the interaction that we share between each other in interpersonal relationships. Those are the connections that are the losses that are hard to get over within, these, when we are triggered and when we remember these things, and why um, these events are recalled. For some, it could be a traumatic event. It could lead to intense, overwhelming emotions that are involuntary but intent, but are heavy, right?
Yeah.
So just to be mindful of recognizing your body, right? And how do you deal with the sensory overload? Because
Hmm.
for some, they may go into a panic attack, right?
Hmm.
So for me, I use the same senses that sensory impact they're having. I try to help individuals ground themselves and impact by getting over their grief if they're having a panic attack. So I'll
Hmm.
say to them, use your same five senses, So what are five things that you see? What are five things that you smell? What are five things that you hear? What are five things that you could potentially touch? Just to be able to ground them in the here and now, to get
Hmm.
over the panic attack and center them in, like, this thing that's happening in your mind is probably not happening in and around you,
Hmm.
just to get them out of that fight, flight, or freeze state that they may
Hmm.
be going through as a result of the trigger pending them having a panic attack, for example.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought that up, because when you look online on, like, coping with grief,
Mhm,
the exact steps you just did are one of the things that comes up. That
mhm,
five senses exercise to
mhm,
try to ground people. Another thing that comes up is that people tell them to, like, kind of prepare for these triggers,
mhm,
and kind of replace memories, make new memories, and do all this
mhm.
stuff. And so that's why I was really asking about the brain thing, because I'm like, is it that I can replace? Because you know,
Well, what we're trying to do is, because so these triggers, if it's leading to a panic attack, you could probably recognize it happening or realize what happens when you have a panic attack. So
yeah,
what we're trying to do is disrupt your reaction so you don't have a panic attack, so that
yeah,
you're not having, for example, palpitating, your heart's not palpitating,
Right.
right? You're probably not hypervigilant where you're looking over your shoulder. You're probably not setting or sweating or pacing. So
Yeah.
just trying to minimize some of those symptoms so
Yeah.
that they don't get worse or become complex, because those symptoms oftentimes is what leads to the mental health or the post-traumatic stress, the depression, the anxiety, and or might be a predisposition to opening up a mental health that was probably dormant, for example, in some.
Yeah. Uh, and so good that you said that, because last kind of question in this segment on triggers
Mhm.
is some of this unresolved grief that is showing up in daily life?
It could be, because for some, depending on the situation, if it was traumatic, for example, oftentimes we don't want to remember. Um, a good example would be oftentimes individuals that deal with childhood trauma, they often don't remember. Um, Not to say they don't remember, they probably keep it dormant. Let me be clear.
Mm-hmm.
And then something in life brings it all back where they now remember. A good example of that is I know a lot of my clients during COVID um, a lot of them suffered from unresolved trauma because now they had all of this quiet and time, and now all of these memories are coming back, and they
Mm-hmm.
don't even know where they're coming from, but they are so super clear,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's just something about life and your sensory perception and your subconscious and conscious that holds on to these things and brings them back at times.
Yeah. I want to pivot us a little bit to relationships and social dynamics that come
Hmm.
with grieving. Because, like, sometimes you'll be online and you see people saying, you should do better. People need to do better with
Hmm.
handling grief. And one of the things that comes up is friendships and even family members. Sometimes we lose friendships, or friendships get reshaped.
Hmm.
Sometimes we lose other relationships in the process of grief. Like, you can think about couples who lose a child, for example.
Hmm.
Dealing with that loss
Hmm.
can bring a fracture
Hmm.
in the relationship. There's so many ways that our personal grief can impact relationships. I want to play this young lady. I saw her on TikTok. Her name is Janika, and she's talking about the impact of grief on relationships. And what she wanted from relationships too. So let's hear this.
You will lose friends when your parent dies, and it's because the Western world is not designed or equipped to handle grief, merely to profit off of it. There will be a sense of urgency from some of your friends for you to get back to your old self or to regular scheduled programming, but the truth is, a piece of you dies the day your parent does. And I remember when my mom died, I was granted 5 days of bereavement at work, and I think it's customary in Ontario for you to get 3 to 5, but I could be wrong. And I thought, wow, what a steal. 5 days in exchange for the 30 years I had with the woman who brought me into this world. How am I going to allocate my time? The first 2 days can be designated to crying. The third day is the visitation. Day 4 is the funeral. And by day 5, I have to pull myself back together because on day 6, I need to be back at my desk responding to emails. And the best way I know how to explain grief to anyone is it's like a glitter bomb goes off. You can do your absolute best to clean it up, to make it look neat and tidy, but you will still find glimpses and glimmers of it in the most random of places and in the most random of moments. So if you are someone who is experiencing grief and loss, I want this to be your permission slip to take your time. Even if it feels like the world around you is moving at a million miles a minute at light speed, you are allowed to slow down because it is a process and a lifelong one at that. And you owe it to yourself, but also the person who is no longer here with us, to feel it, because that is where the love for them resides.
So, she started off there saying, you will lose friends. Why do some friends disappear after loss, or seemingly disappear?
Well, I would say there's no right answer because it could be a lot of things for a lot of people. Um, but based on my work and recognizing that this seems to be something that happens a lot. I would say what I notice within my work, trying to bring it home, would be oftentimes the individual dealing with grief. In the beginning, everyone's around, for example, and they're showing their support, they're showing up, and no fault of their own. Oftentimes, people go back to their regular life, right? So, one of the things to ask is, how often were you seeing these people anyway? I
Yeah.
think a term that we use is adulting, like people just living life. But when specifically people lose life, you honestly see who shows up for you, because
Yeah.
oftentimes the person going through it in the immediate, you might be calling and reaching out, and they're not as forthcoming. Again, as we identified earlier, they may be dealing with the beginning stages of their grief, which may take up, there's no number, but just, based on looking at reflecting on what we've talked about so far, let's just use 2 years as a marker.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're calling your friend over the period of 2 years and they, seem to not be coming around, you're probably going to give up and move on,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that friend is going to remember the ones that kept on calling,
Mm-hmm.
kept on coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that continue to show up are the ones that they're going to be depending on, because they were predictable, they were dependable, and so on.
Yeah.
I think I'll also share this. There are times when the people that you engage with, they don't know how to talk to you about their grief. There's a level of how do I talk to you about the situation, depending on how the person died.
Yeah.
If it was based on age, it might be easier. If it was based on illness, it might be easier. But if it was an accident or sudden death in any
Yeah.
particular way, those are harder,
Yeah.
because it was just not expected.
Yeah.
So there's a multitude of reasons why some people stay and why some people go.
Yeah.
For some people leave because they're just not able to deal with it or deal with you.
They don't feel they have the right answers, right? They don't
Right.
have the
And
right
some people,
words. They
yeah,
don't
the
have,
right words, 100%. That's where
yeah.
that awkwardness
Yeah.
comes in, where people just don't know
Yeah.
how to talk about it. And one of the things that I want to also be clear is, oftentimes the person that is impacted, they're also exhausted of telling their story,
Right.
because they're re-traumatized every time they tell their story. They go
Yes.
into a
How did the
deeper
person
sense.
die? What happened? How did it go? You don't want to
Hmm.
tell them every time.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say it's one thing. It might be a multitude of things,
Yeah.
right? But just to recognize, I would say, based on the work that I do and the clients that I see, I think there should be a level of grace,
Yes.
specifically when you understand how the person died, specifically when you understand the level of relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just that odd thing where it seems like there's a social constructed norm where we believe that a person should just get over it. And
Yeah.
that's not the case.
No.
I've come to recognize within my own grief and loss through my work and my personal life that these things stay with you. And, you try to find a way to carry this. Again, I keep referring to it as this weight. You
Mm-hmm.
try to find a way to deal with this weight as you move on. Sometimes this weight is heavier, sometimes it's lighter, sometimes you don't feel it, sometimes it goes away. Sometimes when it goes away, you feel guilty because you're wondering what happened.
Yeah.
So there's so much happening.
So much going on. Yeah. I will submit this that
Mhm,
maybe because I've experienced so much loss in my life, I
mhm,
come to things with a different lens. Everybody can't be everything you need
mhm,
in the times when you think you need it. And we can talk about this further around boundary setting and so on. But you know, I give grace to the people who have no clue what to say,
mhm,
because we don't have these conversations. How often do we see, a talk show doing a grief segment, right?
mhm,
We don't have these conversations. We don't even have the language around it. We don't even know that we might be inadvertently harming somebody who sees us as a friend, right? We we don't even know.
I
So
think you made a key point there.
yes,
Sometimes in our, I'll call it checking in on our friend, we say
we
there's a bit
think we're
of
being well-meaning.
meaning, and there's a bit of gaslighting, there's a bit of shaming, there's a bit
Yeah,
of there's this we don't know what we do
yeah,
sometimes when we say things and we don't use words intentionally and with compassion and understanding.
yeah, yeah,
Sometimes we create so much harm in how we address someone that has had a loss that we wouldn't even recognize that, you know what, we probably might have just pushed them over the edge.
yeah.
You know, and I don't think that's intentional in any way.
Yeah, it may not be intentional, but should
Mhm.
the person grieving, should they
Mhm.
speak up? Should they try to advocate for themselves, or should they just ignore and move on?
I think it could be any one of those answers could be right? Because it could be what we echoed earlier, like they're just tired of telling their story. And sometimes people are just tired of being tired,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
So the emotions that come up as a result of this fatigue is like you're cynical, you're short, you know, you're probably a bit more shrewd, you're probably just very clear, you're not very eloquent, you're just yes and no, you're not giving a lot,
yeah.
right? So talking to someone like that is hard. It could be hard. And
Mm-hmm,
sometimes not a lot of us know how to sit in uncomfortable silence,
right,
right?
right.
And sometimes that's what's needed. The person just wants a presence
Yeah,
and they just want someone to know that they're okay,
yeah,
but they don't want to talk, you
yeah.
know? And also recognizing, I think that's probably a good thing to know. Like, what does a person need? You know, I think that might just be, just ask, what do you need right now that might be supportive? Do you
Right.
need time away from me? Do you want me to check up on you? So sometimes just asking clarifying questions where you identify the boundaries. Sometimes we don't know our own boundaries and we infringe and bombard those people with intrusive emotions that they just don't want to deal with.
Yeah. And I want to touch on this before we leave this segment on relationships. How does grief affect intimacy, dating, partnerships, marriages, whatever the case may be? How does grief
That
um
is a huge question. And it's also a part of the screening, to be very honest.
mhm,
We talked about the physical symptoms, some of the psychological symptoms, the change in life and behavior. Um, One of the psychological symptoms is the change in libido. Like
mm,
you just lose the interest of intimacy on every
mhm,
level. And for some, it's just like the idea of it just becomes systemic, where it's just like, I don't want to do this. Right.
right.
So, not only that, intimacy isn't just in the pleasure of the sexual act, it could just be touching, hugging, you know, the love language that people talk about, right? The
Mhm,
level of connection that they probably had prior to the loss, where for either party there's zero interest there. And I think that's what makes relationships fragile, because
mhm,
things aren't the same, because the person is changing right in front of you, and you
mhm,
don't know if and or when, if things will be balanced again, or if they'll come back to a baseline that we would consider normal, right?
yeah.
And I think that in itself takes time.
Mhm. And I must interject here. We are speaking with Greg and Leslie, who is a psychotherapist who
Mhm.
can help you over this kind of hump, right, Greg? Being able to get back to that baseline, because we don't want to not be able to hold each other or to experience intimacy because of grief. But grief can be that overwhelming,
Mhm.
and can ask of us, because I think grief asks us to do some stuff, and I think
Mhm.
it can ask of us to shut it down. you know and
Mhm.
and and maybe it's a part of controlling, right?
Mhm.
Controlling something you feel like you can control, because you can't control the grief. You
Mhm.
have no say over the loss,
Mhm.
and you're like, this is an area I can control. I don't
Mhm.
want you to touch me. I don't want to experience, maybe I don't even want to experience pleasure because I feel like it's a betrayal, whatever is going on there, right?
I think you hit a lot of key points. Oftentimes, people, I'm generalizing, want permission to be sad, and they should be allocated time to feel sad.
Hmm.
But what I would say is, how long are we staying there? Clinically, we know that, when sadness and depression, moves from weeks into months, we need to be concerned around the level of depression or sadness the individual is having. We want to scale if that sadness and depression, sorry, is becoming hopelessness,
Mm-hmm.
because that hopelessness could lead to a lack of purpose, for the individual, and might lead to, broadly, suicidal ideation for some, because there might be that sense of grief or survivor's guilt, depending on what's going on. So it's really pendant on the individual, the different onslaught of symptoms, because I think that's what's missed. A person just may feel like that person may die, but one of the things, again, I want to echo is the amount of different emotions that are happening: sadness, anger. I think anger is one that I want to unpack just a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not just, are you angry? You might be angry at yourself. You might angry at the person, that has that that's now gone, or the loss that you've had. You might be angry at society. You might be angry at some of the processes that happen, throughout, if the person, was deceased. So anger is something that individuals have to be mindful of, just in regards to how it's projected and who it's projected at, and how much harm the anger is having on ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's this anger. Oftentimes, when we talk about anger, we talk about the iceberg.
Right.
What we could see is above the water, but there's just so much more under the surface.
Yeah.
So it's really getting to, the underlining issues as it relates to the anger is important, so we could identify it, so that it's not, impacting us so much internally, through the stress that we're
Or
going to face.
overwhelming.
Some of these
Yeah.
things, right?
Yeah. Um, and as we talk about relationships, I want to talk about parents. Whether it is a loss of a child and they have other children to continue finding normalcy for,
Hmm.
or they just watching you experience loss.
Hmm.
How can parents be experiencing loss, and what are some of the key things that we want to give them to, like, take away from this process?
I deal with this directly within my work.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say to parents, just let me just echo a few things before. For parents, again, I'm not putting mom or dad on a hierarchy, because they both probably love their children equally and equitably. But for moms, oftentimes they feel that void within their womb, where it's just like it's just like that connection just seems to be severed, and it just feels like a void for a lot of mothers. If those are mothers that have other children, oftentimes they become helicopter parents, where they want to know where you're going, who you're going with, what you're doing, just because they don't want to suffer that level of loss. And oftentimes it just seems like they cannot recover. Through my conversations with mothers that I continue to have, that are on this healing journey, um, not speaking for them, but a lot of them just feel like this constant pause, and they're just stuck.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for them to move on.
Mm-hmm.
They show up in the way of being responsible, because, as we identified before, life doesn't stop because of these losses. So they may show up, but oftentimes they're not as happy as they used to be. They're a bit more sullen.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of urgency and eagerness around life, and being intentional and definite. Um, and for those that in their mourning process that are able to, find other mothers that grieve, to unpack, their grief, oftentimes, in my experience, they participate in therapy, because it helps them identify the varied emotions that they have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to generalize, mental health, but they don't
Right.
want to feel like they're going crazy, or something's happening that's out of their control.
Mm-hmm.
So oftentimes being able to name these symptoms and help them understand that they're dealing with, long-term grief, complex grief, post-traumatic stress, that their grief has now emerged into depression and or anxiety has been helpful. Oftentimes, when dealing with parents and families, there's a change in their sleep. Sleep is something that impacts our mental health greatly.
Yeah.
So, just having to find ways to 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 be able to sleep and have peace, because when I say to sleep and have peace, there's just so much happening in their mind, a lot of racist thoughts, a lot of intrusive thoughts. So just really finding ways to cope. One of the things that make grief hard to deal with in a society is that your last club dealt with it. 5 bereavement days aren't enough. For a lot of people, therapy isn't, they don't have the
Acceptable.
money, they're accessible. They don't have the money to pay for it, or they can't find a therapist that is able to provide that service. Um, I know there's a lobby to have OHIP, include therapy, psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
I think psychotherapy is definitely a part of health that's not highlighted enough.
Mm-hmm.
That gets the support that other health circumstances do. But for those that are able to move through their grief, speaking to mothers and family, they normally memorialize their children through speaking engagements, writing books. Some of the family that I've dealt with have wrote books. They do a lot of advocacy work. Um, they try to work in programs where they do fundraising throughout the years that agencies within their community could provide therapy. They should try to provide awareness around particular issues. For me, in my work, I work with individuals that are impacted by violence. One of the
Mm-hmm.
roles that I have is victim services. I
Yeah.
work in the serious crime division. So working with families and individuals that have survived violence.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I'm doing grief and or trauma screening,
Yeah.
and I'm giving them a referral if it's long-term impact of grief, a letter to go to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or even go to the hospital depending on what's happening, and or to
Yeah.
have regular checkups with their family doctor. But I try with them to create a network of professionals that can help them, not only
Yeah.
professionals, but friends. So what I'm talking about is creating a system for yourself. So probably some therapy, probably seeing your doctor regularly, probably having, helping them to develop some hobby, some interest. For some, really supporting their long-term disability, where to
Yeah.
get them time off of work,
Yeah.
and continuing to support some mothers that are on my roster now. I've been in private practice 10 years of this year. I've been on my roster for 6 and 7 years.
Yeah.
Just really trying to support them getting time to be able to grieve. We
Right.
don't have that enough in our society.
Yeah.
And I think there should be more of that to allow people to process what they're going through, because evidence shows us that grief and trauma changes the body and its makeup, and it leads to these various outcomes. So if death is so much a universal part of life, why don't we have the parameters in place that make us healthy?
Right.
And some of these losses, I know we're going to talk about it further, happen in our life daily, and they happen in the way of burnout, right? So
Yeah.
there's so many things in our life that leads to us having losses, where we should have more avenues where we're able to maintain our health, but we do not.
Yeah. And you're right. We are going to talk about burnout. We're going to talk about work. We're talking about functioning, and we're
Mhm.
talking about burnout. How does grief, on a simple level, how does it affect even concentration and motivation?
Because when we are dealing with grief and we have intrusive thoughts and we're somewhat a bit more distracted, we're not as focused as we think we are. And sometimes we do tasks just through our muscle memory. We know how to do a particular thing, so we're kind of just going through the process. So what I talk to my patients about, our clients about, are like how do you know that like what's your focus like, and how do you know that it's changed?
Yeah.
And they'll realize things that they were able to do second nature they're not
Yeah.
able to do anymore. So
Yeah.
you'll realize that there's things that we do again second nature every day, whether it be wash dishes, change the TV, where you realize that you're just kind of staring in space,
Yeah.
right? Where these things we're able to identify where they're like, oh my God, I never realized how much I'm not as focused or I'm not aware. I've had clients on my roster who had jobs where they were engineers where they had to stop because their work was sort of systemic where their lack of focus could impact the whole line, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes we don't realize it, but we do when the things that we do, again, that are second nature just become so hard where we realize, but I used to do this so easily. So I would just say
Yeah.
a key way to notice that is, how much effort did you used to put? How much effort are you putting now?
Yeah.
And is it becoming exhausting because you're exhausting, or just maybe you just don't have the energy? Because with one of the symptoms of grief is a loss of energy, right?
Yeah.
And that loss of energy could be your appetite has now changed, so you're not eating and sleeping as well, so your energy is now depleted, right?
Yeah.
You're just having intrusive thoughts all the time where your mind's just racing and you're not able to shut it off.
Yeah.
And then you're probably having disrupted sleep. You're probably having insomnia. So all of those things just disrupt, again, as we're talking about the focus, the concentration, where you
Yeah.
realize, for example, you might be reading a book, but you're reading the same line or maybe just two words over and over, you know?
You're telling my life, Greg, to be honest. You're telling my life, to be honest. I can so self-implicate here. In And I never necessarily tied it to grief because there was multiple losses back
Mhm,
to back for me at one point. Especially since COVID, like I lost my uncle during COVID, couldn't bury him because we were stuck in Canada, can't travel, all this stuff.
mhm,
So I have found personally, I used to be able to keep everything in my head.
mhm,
If you said to me, see you next Friday at 5, you just had to say it to me. It's in
mhm,
my head. My head was a little calendar. Greg, I cannot. If it is not written in my phone, if I don't set alarms, forget about it. I am going to miss it.
mhm,
How I knew I was in trouble, and this is really implicating myself. I missed I missed a couple meetings last year.
mhm,
And I was like, I never, ever miss meetings.
mhm,
And that's when I realized, oh, I'm in trouble here.
mhm,
And so I have been, doing everything in the calendar and so on to give myself like an additional resource
mhm,
to stave it off. But as you're speaking, I'm realizing that functioning through grief
mhm,
shows up in these ways, like malfunctioning,
mhm,
really. um
mhm.
and let's talk a little bit about burnout, because I'm implicating myself, but we can implicate you in
Yes.
in, in the
Which is
work that
fine. Mhm,
you do.
mhm.
Puts you in the high level ranks of people who will face burnout.
Oh, definitely. And so I definitely implicate myself here and share, but not before saying one of the key things that you just mentioned is memory.
Hmm.
Memory is one of the things that are impacted when we're dealing with grief. We
Hmm.
oftentimes become forgetful,
Hmm.
or just memory, just short term or long term memory could be impacted. You might be going downstairs to get some milk, and then by the time you start walking, you start asking yourself, "What was I going to
What
go do
am I
again?"
going for?
Yes, right. To your question on burnout, so I've experienced burnout back in 2005,
Hmm.
and during that time, I was impacted as a result of my work, my personal and professional life. I was living and working in a community. I was living and working in Jane and Finch,
Yeah.
and
For
then
those who are
during.
not from Toronto, Jane and Finch would be considered an NIA, neighborhood improvement area, or a challenging neighborhood, depending on your perspective of it. So
Definitely.
yeah.
So I was working in a community-based program, and during that time, working in a community-based program, 4 clients had lost their life that we had interacted with. 2 lost their lives in a car accident. 1 lost their life in 2005 in a school shooting. And then 1 client literally just left our office and was murdered in his hallway. Um, and then in my personal life, 2 of my friends were shot. 1 died and then 1 survived. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, I became very cynical, very short, almost wanted to disappear, just mad at just the idea of my identity and the fact that we're doing this to each other and, things that could be better.
Yeah.
So for me, this showed up in my work. I'm very passionate about my work, if you know me.
Yeah.
But I just lost the passion, like my why disappeared.
Mm.
And then lucky for me, my supervisor to this day is one of my mentors, but they seen how I was changing
Right.
during this period, and they requested a meeting. And during this time, they told me I need to take time off and I need to see a psychologist before coming back to work,
Yeah.
which I did go to do. I could say at the time prior to going, I was worried about being labeled. I was worried about stigma. I was worried about
Oh,
them
yeah.
saying that I have mental health.
The person who helps people.
I'm giving it to you guys, right? So for
Yeah.
me, the first meeting was hard and relieving.
Right.
Hard telling my story because I was worried about what
Being judged.
being judged. But then after saying it, he said to me, "Mr. Leslie, you have a classic case of emotional of fatigue, just burnout, compassionate fatigue, sorry, burnout, and at that
Mm-hmm.
time, it was a language that I was familiar with, but
Mm-hmm.
I got to realize that the work that I do leads to burnout. It's one of the number one profession that leads to burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I was engaging with a personal and professional living and working in a community that was impacted by violence at the time and losing my clients, I had gotten 2 months off. During this 2 months off, I seen the psychologist bi-weekly. I went to the gym. I started exercising twice a day, just really imparting self-care, which is
Mm-hmm.
became important to myself and to my work. So I learned that I can't lead from an empty vessel.
Mm-hmm.
I need to pour into myself to be able to help others.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to be able to recognize my own blind spots, what we call in social work, and to realize that the way I felt is probably equally how clients feel when they're coming to me for the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So just being able to that experience helped me to help people better, to be
Yeah.
very honest,
Yeah.
because it gave me empathy and a level of compassion that I did not have in
Mm-hmm.
understanding what it would be like, what it's like to be so vulnerable and to give so much of yourself for people to be non-judgmental,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It would totally change how you approach listening to somebody's storytelling now, right?
Definitely,
Because
definitely.
you realize not only are they dealing with grief, but they're dealing with the fear of your response to whatever they're about to tell you. So you have a
100%.
different lens now. So you're
100%.
superpower activated now.
Well, definitely, because now in my work, and then I identified dealing with, working my work through victim services and dealing with the families, I'm able to identify when I'm not well in some of the stories that I hear and being caretaker to so much vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
to so much of people just having to to tell so much and to feel so empty and to feel so vulnerable and to feel so overwhelmed with
Mm-hmm.
emotions that they just
Mm-hmm.
don't understand at the time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in my sessions, I try to make them psychoeducational, where I'm giving education. It's not just clinical, and really trying to identify some of the nuances around grief and how we understand it, you know, from a Black perspective, if I could call it that, based on the various cultures that we intersect, and trying to provide representation. Because living in these communities and dealing with grief, I wouldn't say it's different, but oftentimes these communities are dealing with ongoing generational grief, and they're dealing with grief daily through the trauma that they face. And for me, I was living and working in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, through the privilege of understanding these things, I was able to move out of community, but still provide a lot of work in community. And just to be able to recognize creating a distinction between the personal and professional and turning off and creating healthy boundaries around the work. Because we do carry this work home,
Yeah.
because
And we have gone into that segment on coping, right? So being able to set, as you said, healthy boundaries, and kind of extricating your physical self from a path that was complicating your work, to being able to be on the other side of it, to have that lens now that you've gone through it, but also be able to provide resources to the same community in a different way.
Correct.
So that is important. And I want to interject here a clip from Jay Shetty, who talks about grief being like a stone. And I found his analogy very good, and I think it's good to give us that leap over into surviving and coping.
My friend told me something beautiful about grief that I don't think I'll ever forget. They said to me that grief is like a stone, and you carry it in your pocket, and you'll always notice it, you'll feel it, you know it's there. But as time goes on, you get stronger. And so as you get stronger, it's not that the stone goes away, it's just that it gets lighter.
Wow.
And so it's lighter to carry, but it doesn't mean it's going away. You didn't move on. You didn't have to get over it. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't get smaller. It stays the same. You just get stronger, so the stone gets lighter.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that idea around grief, because it sat true with me that it didn't have to go away. I didn't have to let go of it. I didn't have to forget about it. And that it would always be there. But just as I grow and as I strengthen and as I become more resilient, it becomes lighter and doesn't weigh on me in the same way as the heavy feeling of grief can in the beginning.
So, in talking about that stone getting lighter, what are some of the daily practices that help people to, live alongside grief? Because
Right.
we're still carrying the stone.
It's definitely still carrying the stone. I think he mentioned it within his answer, but I'll definitely add to it the resilience, the strength. And I'll speak to the strength before giving some other examples. Sometimes when we deal with a lot of grief for those that have, sometimes the strength could be a binary, good or bad, because then we're expected to be strong all the time and we don't release our grief. So I'd say be mindful of being strong or too strong or overly strong, because sometimes that may tilt the pendulum. One of the things that we need to do, as we've been talking about, recognize and know the symptoms of grief. I think if you recognize and know the symptoms of grief, it helps you on the path to being able to continue to be resilient and to continue to get over it and to cope with it. But if we don't oftentimes know what those symptoms are, then they become overwhelming. And as I said earlier, when I'm talking to my clients, we go through the array of symptoms, we identify them to see which of them are connected to their grief, so that they're able to have relief in those things and to find areas of relief. If it's clients that have a barrage of symptoms, oftentimes I could tell that they're probably going to deal with a bit of hypervigilance, paranoia, and or just difficulty sleeping. So again, I'm going back to the symptoms to be able to help people. So for those, just finding ways, for those that can't sleep, I'll probably say, you know what, is there something that you could do within your day that's an activity like walking or, exercising or going to the gym, to be able to make them a bit more tired because their minds are so focused. to do some mindfulness grounding exercise is, I would say, is important to be able to have, I would say, authentic friendships where you could be unfiltered and not judged. Because sometimes individuals, may peek out of pocket or out of turn, but we don't mean that. We're just going through so much that we need to have trusted people to be able to help us through this process. We need to try not to isolate ourselves, and we need to try to hold on to the things that we used to do as much as possible. Because the more we let those things go, the more we go into isolation, the more we go into depression. I do recognize that the immediate grief would limit us doing those things. But over time, if we're able to get back to the things that we once used to enjoy, it might help us in our journey in being healthier again, or making the stone lighter where we recognize it's still there, but we're able to deal with it in a way healthier, what I would say, with more wellness and more intention.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what I would say, that's very much about the process, right? So for a lot of my clients, the grief doesn't go away, but they find ways to do speaking engagements to to show up for others that have grief or that have had been impacted by grief in a particular way. Um, it is very much about, I would say, finding your community. Because for those that I've worked with, when they're able to identify and find people that understand them without judgment, because it's been 5 or 10 years, and they don't feel like they should get over it, there's a sense of relief
Mm.
for those that find their community or their village. Um, I would just say take time. You don't have to talk about it today. And I would say for those that you haven't checked up on, um, check up on them. I think for
Yep.
me, having the right social circle was important, because at the time as I identified I was living and working in the community, I also needed to set boundaries around the friendships that I've had and the ones that may have connected me to situations that I didn't want to be connected to, just based on some of the violence that were happening in the community. So just recognize that we need to choose our relationships, because sometimes it ties us to losses that we could probably never get over. And it leads us to make tough choices around who do we want to be and who do we want to be on this journey with.
Yeah.
Because some people are in our life for a lifetime, while others are just in our life for a season, right?
Right.
Really finding ways to understand your health. One of the things that I talk about in our work is social location. So what's available to you based on your resource in your life is very important, because I could tell you to do these things to cope, but you might not have the resources to do this, right? So I really try to understand the person, their lifestyle, the things that they used to do and the things that they're doing now, and try to remind them to do some of those wellness things, because those are the recesses and breaking points of their grief that gives them the opportunity to be well each and every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. And we definitely want to celebrate those of you who are taking that bold step to addressing grief through therapy and addressing grief through the examples that Greg just spoke about. It takes some amount of courage to identify that you need help and to identify ways to channel the grief to purpose, right?
Mm-hmm,
um,
mm-hmm,
and we'll speak about that in next week's episode. Actually, we'll talk about healing, meaning, moving forward, and purpose, and so on. So I think we can leave here. I want to leave our folks with some reassurance. Greg,
mm-hmm,
what do you say to someone who feels like or felt like
mm-hmm.
they are failing at this grief journey? What do we want to say to them before we go?
I would say you're not failing. If you showed up today and you're here and you're present, you're doing it. If you're able to put one foot in front of the other, you're doing it. If you're able to get out of bed or not get out of bed, you're doing it. And grief takes time. There is no placeholder where it says you should be in first place. It's not a race. It's a journey. It's not even. It's a lifelong course that you will adjust to and be able to adapt to. Just know that, you're here for a reason and a purpose. And you keep showing up. And the fact that you keep showing up every day means that, you know what, you recognize that, there's more to you and the losses that you have gone through. And as you know, we're here to support you. And for those that are in your life, give that person grace and show up for them also, because they may and are going through a lot. But your understanding, empathy, and compassion will go a long way for them recognizing that, you know what, you are writing for them the whole time.
Yes, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you again, Greg and Leslie, our in-home psychotherapist in our grief class. And yet another class wrapped up. We will put in the caption for this episode some resources, because Greg mentioned off camera that he actually talked about the burnout stuff, right, Greg, for a journal article.
Yes.
So if you could send me that,
Mhm.
so that we can put it in the caption. So when it's living on YouTube, you can go and check that out. And we'll also put our check-in sheet again in the caption for you to check in throughout these episodes. We thank you for spending some time with us, sharing space with us, and we hope that this has been a useful kind of journey through navigating grief. Today we talked about living with it, and next week we'll go into how do we move forward. So thanks again, Greg, and we'll definitely see them next week.
Thank you.